Welcome to the 6th Annual Quit Sugar Summit, where the world's leading professors, scientists, MDs, PhDs, coaches, addiction specialists, and dietitians bring you all the information you need to change your relationship with sugar. Here's your speaker. Hey everybody, it's Mike with the Quit Sugar Summit. I'm here with Dr. Casey Means, and I am, again, really excited. I mean, I'm always excited with the guests, but this is a little bit special for me, simply because her topic today is continuous glucose monitors. And I actually am now wearing one for, I would take my sweater off, but it's like a little patch on your arm, and literally on my phone, I can tell you what's going on with my blood sugar continuously. No finger pricks, no nothing. It's just amazing. Dr. Means is a graduate of Stanford University and a researcher and a surgeon turned health evangelist, which is cool because I'm kind of a health evangelist a little bit. But this device that she is a co-founder of a startup with, I think changes the world. I really believe that. People a little shy of the little pin prick, and we'll talk about that goes with the patch, but pretty soon that'll be non-invasive too, and as the technology runs forward. But Casey, thank you so much for doing this, and I really appreciate it. And I know you're a busy person. Startup world's crazy, and you got a lot to do, and you've taken an hour out of your time. I really appreciate it. So how are you? And thanks for doing this.
Thank you so much. And I'm so thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for including me in this, and can't wait for a great conversation.
Cool. So tell the folks about Casey. How did you get into all this, and why did you get into all this? I mean, we talked earlier that this is, this is a newer thing, and people traditionally, and correct me if I'm wrong, but they use it, and all the research to date has been to try and help people with already diabetes and with type 1 and 2. But I think your company leans a little bit towards preventative and biohacking a little bit. I mean, yes, the diabetics will be able to use it, but I think that there's some of that. So how did you get into all this?
Yeah. So, just to give the brief overview about how, what we're building. So what Levels does is, so we are a startup, like you mentioned, and we are leveraging continuous glucose monitoring technology to help health-seeking individuals understand how their diet and their lifestyles are affecting their health in real time. So we empower people, so non-diabetic individuals, people who are just looking to better understand their bodies, their diet, their health, and we empower them with their real-time metabolic information, their glucose levels. And this really lets us, for the first time, close the loop on how our dietary choices are affecting our health. These have been notoriously very open loop systems. You eat something and then you don't really know what that's doing to you. Maybe, the next day you weigh a little bit more, or 6 months from now, you get a fasting glucose check at your doctor's office and it's 2 points higher than last year, or you get a cholesterol test and your triglycerides are 15 or 20 points higher than last year. It's very hard to know what to do in those open loop type of systems where the feedback is not immediate. And the beauty of the device that you were just describing, the continuous glucose monitor, is that it lives on your arm. It's giving you data about your key energetic metabolic building block in your body, glucose, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And that metric, glucose, changes almost instantly after making a food choice. And even after making certain lifestyle decisions, it changes in response to the exercise we're doing or whether we're sedentary. It changes if we haven't had a good night of sleep. It changes if we're stressed. There's so many different things that feed into the levels of glucose in our bloodstream. And so being able to have that instant feedback on how these choices are affecting that is really powerful. And it's really the first time we've been able to close that feedback loop on a lot of these dietary and lifestyle choices that have been notoriously open loop. And big picture, we want to keep our glucose in our bloodstream in as healthy a range as possible and really as stable as possible. And so much of the way that we're living these days, sort of with the Western diet and the Western lifestyle, we are setting ourselves to have our glucose be all over the place, day in and day out, just up and down on a glucose roller coaster, because the majority of the calories that Americans are consuming are refined carbohydrates, grains, and sugars, the vast majority of our calories. And that's going to send glucose on a roller coaster. We're also getting less sleep than we have in years past. We're under chronic low-grade stress and we're more sedentary. And all those things are going to put us on a bit of a glucose roller coaster, which we know not only in the short term can affect our health. In the short term, it can cause energy variability. It can cause mood variability. It can affect our athletic performance. It can affect our acute cognitive performance. But when this happens day after day, year after year, decade after decade, just by the way that we're living, it can also set us up for just a whole host of chronic illnesses that are related to poor glucose control. The most obvious ones, of course, are going to be diabetes and obesity, diseases where it's very clear that the metabolism has gone off course. But what I think a lot of people don't recognize is that actually blood sugar dysregulation is foundationally related to almost every other chronic disease we're seeing in large magnitude in the US. 9 of the 10 leading causes of death in the US are in some way related to blood sugar dysregulation. Everything from stroke to Alzheimer's, dementia, to heart disease, to to chronic liver disease, chronic kidney disease, preventable blindness, and some other things that people definitely don't realize, like infertility, erectile dysfunction, depression, anxiety, autoimmune disease, chronic pain, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue. All of these things in some way are related to metabolic disease. And so the more we can empower people, I think, with information about, first of all, where am I even at in terms of my blood sugar? Not just waiting for once a year to get a single time point measurement, but like, where am I day in and day out, and how are the choices I'm making affecting that? That's what I'm interested in helping people figure out and understand day to day, so they can make better choices that help them improve their lives, both for the short term and the long term. That's what our company is set up to do. And that's really what I focus on in my clinical work as well.
Wow, what a great explanation. Thank you. That was awesome.
Yeah.
So how did you get into it? Like, how did Casey Means get into this world? I mean, what's the trajectory of a surgeon and a Stanford MD? Like, this is not like well known yet. I don't what you're attempting. Obviously a risk in that, but hopefully it will be. But how'd you get into it and why?
Yeah, so for me, it became very clear 5 or so years into my medical practice that the biggest issue facing healthcare globally today is metabolic disease. And so really it became imperative for me to channel my energy into approaching that. And it was a little bit of a circuitous route because, as you mentioned, I started out in surgery and now I run a startup. So basically, I started out as a head and neck surgery resident. So this is treating surgical conditions of the ear, nose, and throat. And it kind of started because I was so struck by how so many conditions I was treating were fundamentally actually rooted in chronic inflammation. So it was a lot of like sinusitis, laryngitis, thyroiditis, and all these itises. In medicine, that's the suffix that means inflammation. And it really caused me to step back and ask, why is there so much chronic inflammation at play? And in each of these different conditions, and we're just so often reaching for our prescription pads or for all sorts of steroids, and steroids quell the immune system. And we can do IV steroids, we can do cream, topical steroids, inhaled steroids, we can do oral steroids. It's amazing how much we're doing in medicine to turn down the immune system instead of asking, what's causing all this inflammation? What is the root cause? Right. And then even more as a surgeon, you're going to the operating room and you're going to, bust a hole in the sinus to suck pus out. But it really struck me that that's helpful. That can help with symptoms, but that does not actually change the underlying core physiology of inflammation. You cannot operate on the immune system. And so I became super fixated on that. What are the root causes? And one of the key fundamental triggers of inflammation in the body is dysregulated blood sugar and metabolic dysfunction. When blood sugar is all over the place, it does trigger the immune system. Like we were talking about, unfortunately, our modern lifestyles and diets, it makes it very difficult to escape metabolic dysfunction. We also know that when we talk about inflammation, most of the chronic diseases we're seeing, like dementia, diabetes, obesity. We know that these are heart disease. We know these are pro-inflammatory states in the body. The immune system is upregulated. So I started really thinking deeply from a systems and network biology perspective. These are, the fields of medicine where we start thinking, what are the links between diseases? What is the underlying web that's connecting all these things? And dysfunctional blood sugar is a very, very key one. Then I dug in a bit more and I realized, it's almost inescapable as an American to not have some problem with your blood sugar unless you're trying really, really hard. We have a University of North Carolina study last year suggested that 88% of American adults are in some way showing a biomarker of metabolic dysfunction. And like I mentioned, 9 of 10 of the leading causes of death in the US are in some way related to dysregulated blood sugar. And 128 million Americans have either prediabetes or diabetes. That's about a third of the country with an overt blood sugar disease. And so that's 128 million Americans. 74% of Americans are overweight or obese. These are astronomical numbers. So while I was, in the operating room doing a lot of these sort of one-off surgeries and working with patients one-on-one on these conditions that I knew in some part were related to these underlying chronic inflammatory drivers, I just really had to step back and say, big picture, how do I want to channel my energy in terms of healthcare? What do I think is going to have the highest return on investment in terms of helping the most people? And to me, this sort of this aspect of health was where I needed to focus my energy. The blood sugar, the metabolic dysfunction, these are preventable conditions by and large. And so how do we empower people with information to not go down this road? The beautiful thing, and what makes it so exciting to intervene on metabolic health and blood sugar, is that it is not a one-way street. We can turn the car around in terms of these issues. When we make better choices and personalized choices day in and day out, we actually improve our body's ability to process energy, to process glucose. And so it's a very hopeful side of medicine. And I think really the first step is having people getting information about where they stand and how the choices they're making are affecting them. So that's where I decided to focus my energy and to team up with other entrepreneurs to create a solution that was really scalable in this regard, since it is such a monumental issue. And the way we traditionally are treating things in medicine is we're very reactive. We wait for overt conditions, symptoms, diseases to emerge before we act. And unfortunately, that's not going to work with this health crisis, because we need to be more proactive about it. We need to be making decisions in our everyday lives to be preventing these conditions. So we're really approaching it from the individual empowerment side of things, while also certainly trying to move the system forward to be more proactive about it. We're giving this information, straight to individuals who want to monitor this in their own lives.
Unbelievable. You just keep impressing here. So look, tell the folks about the history of this little device. And tell them about this pin prick that it goes in. I know people worry about that. Tell them about the application, and I don't want to geek out too bad. But I know that people have been. I did a little research myself, and that they've been thinking there's going to be a solution to this for a long time, and really just now getting to that point. Literally like 15 years or something like that. And I guess there's a non-invasive one, and you can explain what that is in Europe, and why a prescription? I mean, what the hell? I mean, not in Canada, not in Great Britain. No, you can get it over the counter and check this out if you're interested in your blood sugar markers. But in the United States, you got to have a prescription. So tell the folks the history and how you got to where you're at with it.
Yeah. So the continuous glucose monitor is this fascinating little device. It's basically like the size of 2 quarters stacked on top of each other. And you stick it on the back of your arm, and it has a tiny little 4mm probe that actually goes under the skin. So it does go through the skin and that little probe is actually it's like a little lab on your arm. It's coated with a enzyme called glucose oxidase, which actually takes glucose from the fluid around cells in the body, what's called the interstitial fluid. So it's not testing your blood, it's testing the fluid that lives around the cells. and it's picking up, it's the glucose in that fluid is interacting with the glucose oxidase and creates a chemical reaction that basically makes byproducts like hydrogen peroxide. And we pick that up as an electrical signal, which tells us about our glucose. So it's this super cool little lab on your arm. And you put the sensor on, you alluded to this, there's a little prick, there is a needle involved. And basically this tiny little needle pushes that filament that has the enzyme on it into the skin and then retracts. So it's less than a little microsecond of the needle. And for most people who put this on, it's actually, people consider it virtually painless. For well over 90% of people who put this on. I've worn probably 50 of these, and I have never really felt the application. So I'd be curious to hear if you had any pain when you did it.
I didn't have any pain when I put it on, but then like a little bit later in the evening, I did feel it, and then it went away and I haven't felt it since.
Awesome. Yeah. So these stay on the arm through an adhesive for a couple of weeks. There's 3 different brands currently on the market that are FDA approved. These are prescription only medical devices. And the one that our company uses is the Freestyle Libre by Abbott, which lasts on the arm for 2 weeks. It's measuring your glucose in your interstitial fluid every 15 minutes, 24 hours a day, and sending that information to your smartphone. And then after 2 weeks, you just peel the little sensor off and you apply a new one. So it's incredibly simple. These devices have been approved for the use of diabetes management for about 10 years or so. So they are FDA approved for type 1 and type 2 diabetes management. And you can imagine they have been a game changer for these populations who do have to check their glucose multiple times a day for medication management, particularly if they're dosing insulin. It has really changed the game, because opposed to just getting these 3 or 4 snapshots of glucose throughout the day, you're getting this full movie of your glucose throughout the 24 hours and so much more granularity. And just like you have a lot more detail and context in a movie than a photograph, it's the same with the glucose. You can imagine if you eat something, your glucose is going to go up and it's going to come down. And we want that to be as low and flat and quick and up and down as possible. But if let's say it takes 2 hours for it to go up and go down, if you decide to prick your finger maybe 45 minutes after the meal, you could be catching it on the upswing. You could be catching it at the peak, the downswing. You're really not getting full information about the impact of that food or lifestyle activity on what happened to you. You're just catching some random part of that full trajectory. We also know that the way that glucose goes up and down can tell us a lot of information about our health. If we go up really quickly and come down really quickly, if we have a very low response, those things generally tell us that we made a good choice and our body is handling the glucose properly. If we take a long time to peak and we stay elevated for a long time and we end up really high after a meal, it's more suggestive that we might have made not a great choice for our body, and maybe our body's not processing that glucose very well. It's not taking it out of the bloodstream properly. Maybe there's some underlying metabolic issues. So you can imagine having that full picture of that curve, it just gives us a lot more information about our underlying health. So that's what the CGM is. And what Levels, my company, is doing is we're taking this bio-wearable device and we're bringing it to the mainstream. We're taking it out of the population that it was traditionally intended for, which is diabetes management, and moving it to a population who can really use this more as a wellness tool, as a biofeedback tool to understand dietary and lifestyle choices. So we are firmly in the wellness space. We're not intending to prevent any specific disease or treat or reverse any particular symptom or disease. But what we're doing is educating people very heavily on what optimal glucose looks like, and coaching through our software product that takes the glucose data, interprets it, and then help people tweak things about their diet and lifestyle to get that glucose flatter and more stable, which we know is more associated with optimal functioning in the short and the long term.
Wow. So I don't even know where to begin anymore. So so you get to see all these numbers. Tell the folks if there's any crazy numbers of people, and if weight has an effect. So someone comes in relatively overweight and they've got a big sugar habit. Are their numbers steadily high all day when they first come in till they start to realize and see it in black and white? what's going on? What is your experience in, being the, on the front lines of all that, seeing the folks and just give them an indication of that you're actually can peer into their body, and probably hundreds by maybe thousands by this time that you've seen. What do you see in there? What are the numbers? What is the data telling you as far as and do people snap right out of it? I guess that's not the right. Yeah, but yeah, snap right out of it. Like they say, oh, wow, it is high. And then they change their diet quick. What's the behavior mod? And how does the data affect that?
Yeah, so I would say a couple things there. One is it's actually very hard to make generalizations about what's happening in the data, because there are so many different, metabolic health is very much a spectrum. And it's not like there's just normal people and abnormal people. We're kind of all across the board. And a lot goes into how we respond to food. And it's not just your underlying health, it's also other behaviors you've made recently. So I, for instance, could eat a banana today and have a particular glucose response. And then I could get a bad night's sleep tonight and drink some alcohol tonight and have a stressful call tomorrow morning and eat the exact same banana and have a completely different response, totally different. Okay. So there's a lot of interpersonal variability just based on the context. So a lot of what we focus on is building the context within the body to process glucose appropriately. And that's a very holistic thing. It's not just about eating low carb. It's about building conditions in the body that are appropriate for good metabolic processing. And there's a lot that goes into that. Microbiome factors have an impact on our glucose response. Our micronutrient status, things like B vitamins, vitamin D, omega-3, magnesium, these all have an impact on our glucose. And then, of course, like I mentioned, stress, exercise, sleep, and food composition. Even food timing, if we eat late at night versus not eating late at night, that will have an impact on the next day's response. So it can be all over the board for even an individual. But I'll also say, and what's really interesting is that between two people, there's incredible variability. You and I could eat the exact same banana, both, presumably non-diabetic, and we could have vastly different responses. And there was this phenomenal paper that was published in the journal Cell 5 years ago out of the Weizmann Institute in Israel, and it was called Personalized Nutrition by Prediction of Glycemic Responses. And they took 800 healthy non-diabetic individuals and they gave them standardized meals with glucose monitors on their arm and looked at how they responded. And people were all some people just went up a little bit to a standardized meal, other people went way up, and it was all across the board. So it really moves us away from this concept that we have thought about in the past of a glycemic index, which was that, everyone eats this particular amount of one carb and everyone's glucose, it's going to have this impact on people's glucose levels. This paper showed something very different, which was that it's all across the board. And then they looked at what were the determining factors of how could we predict how people would respond based on other biologic factors. And they did find that underlying insulin sensitivity, anthropomorphic features, sort of body type, BMI, proximity to good sleep and exercise, and microbiome factors, all of these were related to how people responded. So that's just to say there's a lot of complexity to it. I will say that if you look at the research, there have been a few research studies looking at glucose levels in non-diabetic individuals wearing continuous glucose monitors. And what you'll find in those is that the typical non-diabetic healthy person wearing a continuous glucose monitor tends to spend about over 90% of the day between a glucose level of 70 and 120. So that's really the core area that people seem to spend their time when they're healthy and non-diabetic. If you look at the American Diabetes Association or the IDF, International Diabetes Federation criteria for what is sort of considered a non-diabetic response to food, they say that you shouldn't be going above 140. The IDF says don't go above 140 glucose level after a meal. But if you actually look at the research, people tend to be more between 70 and 120. So that's probably a range that is where you sort of want to see your glucose the vast majority of the time. But what's incredible is that when you wear these CGMs and you start eating certain foods that you love, you might see your glucose go to 150 or 180 or 200. And so very quickly you can start to say, oh gosh, this is not the right food. This oatmeal that I thought was a heart healthy food. That's one that's been sort of notorious in our customer base, is that people have been having oatmeal and we've had a ton of people go to 180, 200, totally unhealthy glucose levels. And what's fascinating is that after a glucose rise like that, your body is going to produce a ton of this hormone insulin to help you take that glucose out of the bloodstream. And when you have a big spike like that, that insulin is going to just, pour out to soak that glucose up out of the bloodstream. And you can see a crash. You can overcompensate basically after a big spike. So you have a big glucose spike and then what we call reactive hypoglycemia, which is sort of a crash after a spike. You don't see that with a very gentle elevation after a meal because you're not doing that huge insulin surge. And so you see people eating oatmeal for breakfast, and maybe they're also adding some fruit and they're having a glass of OJ. Maybe even they're putting some brown sugar on it. And you can just imagine these glucose spikes can be massive. And then around 11 a.m., they notice, oh gosh, I'm so tired. I need a piece of candy. I need another cup of coffee. And you kind of get that mid-morning slump. And when you put the CGM on and you actually see what's happening, like, oh, I spiked, I crashed, and now I'm tired. This is related to the oatmeal. You sort of start, it's again, that closed loop, and you can start actually making real behavior change. And it's no longer this like trusting the conventional wisdom about what's healthy. It's no longer about, aligning with a specific nutritional ideology. You're just seeing your data and realizing it's not working for you, and it's creating subjective outcomes that are not positive. And you can, fundamentally, I think that's really the root of behavior change. So in our program, we really try and tie things together for people in that way, which is I made an action, I saw my objective data, and I clued into my subjective experience. And I think that trifecta really is at the root of the simplest behavior change. So the more we can draw those three together, how I feel, what my data did, the choice I made, I think the more we can make progress.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, we do it with journaling now. They can kind of do the crash and how they felt before they used it. So I have a question. What is diabetes? Is it a range? I know there's probably many factors, but what is pre-diabetes? In other words, do these have numbers associated? You say 70 to 120 is kind of, and that's what I'm finding. Those are my numbers. I mean, I ate a big, what do you call it? A sweet potato, and it went to 188. I'm like, yeah. What the hell? And then, but what is diabetes? Is that like it stays up at 160, 180 or something? What is that? How do people know that they may, that they may have prediabetes or diabetes itself?
Yeah. So currently in the US, it's diagnosed through 3 different types of lab tests that people can do. So one is a fasting glucose, which is like either done through a vein blood draw or through a finger prick at the doctor's office. Okay. And if your glucose fasting, meaning not having consumed any calories for 8 hours, is below 100 milligrams per deciliter, you're considered non-diabetic. If it's between 100 and 125, you're considered pre-diabetic. And if it's 125 or above, you're considered to have diabetes. There's 2 other tests. One is called a hemoglobin A1C, which is a blood test that looks at a 3-month average, roughly 3-month average of your blood sugar, by actually looking at your red blood cells and seeing how much glucose is stuck to your red blood cells. So that's called glucose glycated stuck to hemoglobin. That's what a hemoglobin A1C is. And so there's different ranges for that. And, that put you into non-diabetic, pre-diabetic, diabetic. And then there's the oral glucose tolerance test. And so that's where you're given a glucose drink in the doctor's office. And it's a really gross, nasty drink that either has 50 or 75, typically 75 grams of glucose in it. And you take that, and then your blood is checked for glucose at time points over 2 hours after that drink. So you have that elevation and that decline. And at the 2-hour time point, if your glucose is below 140, you're considered non-diabetic. If it's between 140 and 180, it's considered pre-diabetic, and 180 and above is considered diabetic.
Okay, so the reaction, okay.
So there's these ranges, and that's basically how it's diagnosed. And fundamentally, so that's numbers. When we talk about what's actually happening in the body, what the spectrum that we're on is a spectrum of insulin resistance. So that's the core process that is happening when people are moving from metabolically healthy to less metabolically healthy to prediabetes to diabetes. And what that means on sort of a simple level is that, like I mentioned, when glucose goes up in our bloodstream because of what we eat or other lifestyle factors, our body needs to get that out of the bloodstreams into the cells so that it can actually be processed for energy, or if there's excess, that it can be stored, either stored as glucose or stored as converted to fat. The body gets that out of the bloodstream into the cells through secreting this hormone called insulin. And when insulin is asked by the body to be secreted over and over and over again in high amounts because of what we're eating and how we're living, the cells actually become numb to insulin. They kind of say, like, there's too much of this. The cells can't do anymore with all this glucose. We become resistant to insulin. And then what you start to see is the body's like, well, we got to get it out of the bloodstream. So we're going to produce more insulin to shove it into the cells. So you get what's called hyperinsulinemia, high insulin state. So after meals and at baseline, your body is just producing more and more insulin to overcome the resistance of these cells, because it's saying energy is fundamental to life. We need to get the glucose into the cells to produce energy. Like, that has to happen. So the body starts compensating. Over time, that process gets a little bit out of hand. And then your body can't overcompensate anymore. And that's when you start to see the glucose in the blood just rising at baseline, like your fasting glucose. But it can be years of compensating with the body just pumping out more and more insulin before you actually see that fasting glucose go up. So by the time you're seeing these lab abnormalities with glucose, this stuff has probably been off the rails for over a decade. And there's research that actually shows that insulin resistance, which we don't really test for in standard practice, we test for glucose, which is a downstream effect of this. But the insulin resistance shows up probably around 13 years in some research studies before glucose values actually start changing. So there's many, many physicians who are starting to be more interested in checking markers of insulin resistance, like a fasting insulin level instead of a fasting glucose level, because you can imagine, not to get too technical here, but you and I could both have a fasting glucose of 85, which is well in the normal range. But my glucose could be 85 and my fasting insulin, the amount of insulin I have to produce to keep it at that could be very low, like a value of 2 to 5. But yours could be 30. Your body could be producing out so much more insulin to keep it at that level. So we, by glucose, look like exact same metabolic health, but by insulin, it's clear that the body's having to compensate a lot more for that. So there's a lot of fascinating movement in the health space about how we can actually better assess these things and how we can be more predictive about what's happening and help people kind of keep people out of hot water long before they start seeing lab abnormalities. So that sort of is a general overview to answer your question.
That was awesome. I really appreciate it. So, I mean, how do folks, they have to get the test. This pre-diabetes number scared the hell out of me, and I'm sure everyone else. And most people are walking around, a lot of people are walking around possibly with pre-diabetes. So what would be your suggestion, short of an exam? Like, how do they tell? I love what you're doing so that they can at least, maybe if the numbers are high, they can go get an exam. But how do they tell otherwise? And also, why do they ignore it, in your opinion? I mean, why do they just say, well, it can't happen to me, and they just go on for a decade without worrying about it, and they just keep eating the way they're eating? And this knowledge is out there. I just don't understand why folks are not acting on it more, I guess.
Yeah. Well, one interesting statistic that I believe comes out of the CDC suggested that, so there's 90 million pre-diabetic individuals in the US, and 84% of them don't know that they have prediabetes. Right. These are hard statistics to, I would take them with a grain of salt because it's difficult to really know these things for like the entire population.
It's close enough or big enough, whatever. Go ahead.
Right. That's published in the literature. And so that's fascinating. Prediabetes is a state that is largely reversible. So we want to catch all these people and help them. I think one of the reasons why it's been challenging for people to care about this maybe is because we tend to, in our in our medical culture to very much associate glucose specifically with diabetes. It's like glucose is a diabetes issue. And we are less prone to thinking about glucose as actually what it is, which is it's a fundamental unit of energy in the body. And every cell in the body needs to process glucose effectively to work. So any tissue in the body, brain, liver, kidney, eye, ovaries, they all need to process glucose effectively in order to work. And so what we're learning is that when that spectrum starts where you're not processing glucose effectively because you're becoming insulin resistant, you're not getting your glucose into your cells and processing it properly, this can show up as almost any condition or symptom based on where that's happening in the body. So, people who are feeling fatigued, who have a lot of brain fog, who have anxiety, who have depression, infertility, erectile dysfunction, fatty liver disease, who are, there's a number of different symptoms that we know are associated with blood sugar dysregulation, but the average person isn't connecting those two things together because our healthcare paradigm has been, I don't need to care about glucose until I have prediabetes or diabetes. But I think there's so many diverse symptoms that may in some way be little signals that maybe there's something wrong with the way I'm processing, the way my cells and my tissue is processing glucose in the body, that I think if we were more aware of, we'd sort of be like, oh, maybe I should look into this. Maybe I should relate these things. There's a couple of amazing books that have come out recently that are really drawing this relationship. One is Dr. Ben Bickman's Why We Get Sick, which goes through basically every organ system in the body, every symptom, and says, this is why these conditions, this is the research that shows that these conditions are in some way related to glucose dysregulation, AKA issue with how we're processing energy in our body. And Jason Fung's The Obesity Code and the Diabetes Code, those also go into a lot of that. And I would, Dr. Mark Hyman's The Blood Sugar Solution is really fantastic. He talks about more the holistic nature of how metabolic dysfunction is really the trunk of the tree of so many different things. And when we start to move into that framework and that becomes more of the zeitgeist of health, I think we'll start seeing people thinking about this a little bit more. So certainly a lot of these healthcare leaders like Jason Fung and Mark Hyman and Ben Bickman are really starting to like raise the alarm for this type of thing so that we can start thinking a little bit earlier about it.
Yeah, no, we love all of them guys. That's great. I didn't know about Dr. Bickman, so I'll check that out.
Amazing book.
Yeah. So, like I said, we're going to run out of time before I run out of questions or more that I would like to geek out on this with you for a long time, but we do have to keep it. I know you have a schedule and we can't have, I was telling somebody, I like the Tim Ferriss podcast, like 2.5 hours. I'd like to get into those more.
Absolutely.
But, I always like to ask, what am I missing? What does Casey Means and the group at Levels want to get out in the world? That can be secondary, but what question didn't I ask that you think might be that folks should need to know on this platform? I mean, they're all trying to quit sugar. They're all trying to get health. They're all healthy. They're all trying to figure out prediabetes and metabolic syndrome. Tell the folks what you think that the most important things that they should know.
Well, one thing that's definitely worth mentioning in this conversation is the relationship between this and weight, because I know a lot of people are trying to lose weight, and that is something that I think is a very empowering thing to focus on. So, traditionally we've focused on calories in, calorie out models of weight loss, like eat less, move more, and you'll lose weight. And for so many people that doesn't work and also just leads to like endless frustration and just a really emotional journey with food that is often not positive. What we've learned, sort of building off our previous session about insulin, is that something that's really fascinating about insulin, aside from the fact that it is a signal to the body to take up glucose into our cells, is its secondary effect, is that it tells the body to stop breaking down any fat. When insulin's high, it's a full brake on fat burning. And the reason for that is because we have glucose or we have fat to use for energy in the body. And if glucose is really high, it tells the body we don't need to use fat for energy. So when glucose is high, insulin is a signal that says, stop burning fat, we've got tons of glucose, even though in high insulin states, we're not processing glucose effectively. So we actually really have to decrease that insulin level and get the insulin down to be able to unlock the fat burning that is required for burning fat and weight loss. So it's really pretty fascinating how when we get control of our blood glucose levels through our diet, through our lifestyle, we over time, our cells perk up again to that insulin. We become more insulin sensitive again. And that is actually lifting the brake off of fat burning. So I think there's a huge empowering message for people. And this is really the core focus of Jason Fung's book, The Obesity Code, of how orienting more around glucose and insulin could be really a key for much, much more effective weight loss. If you eat 100 calories of, nuts, for instance, which have very little glucose and are not going to spike insulin, versus 100 calories of refined sugar, in the calorie out, calorie in model, you'd think, oh, well, it's the 100 calories. So they're going to just basically have the same impact on weight. But that's not true, actually. That glucose is going to cause a totally different hormonal cascade than the nuts. And that hormonal cascade is the accelerator on the brake and the brake on weight loss and fat burning. So I think that's just an important thing to note, that for people who have been frustrated with weight loss, that I think orienting through, the easiest low-hanging fruit is eliminate all the refined sugar and refined carbohydrates. That's kind of one of the easiest things to do. And then certainly a product like Levels or CGM or testing blood sugar, that kind of really gets into much more of the nuanced side of things. Like, how do we really keep our glucose as low and stable as possible? But certainly the low-hanging fruit is what you talk about, of course, which is the refined sugar. And
so tell me why, like Gary Taubes and I spent an hour talking about this. Why do you think, and this is probably a personal opinion of yours, but like, why do you think that information persists out there, that calories in, calories out is the way to lose weight, and that doctors and everyone still believes this? And like Dr. Fung and Mark, all these folks have basically, and Gary's written 3 or 4 books trying to get the science out to prove this is not true anymore. Why do you think that myth kind of persists?
It's a challenging question. And I think one is that the way we practice medicine in the US, there's a lot of positives about it. One is that we tend to be very rigorous and evidence-based. And before we make changes in what we recommend to patients, these findings have to be extremely validated, have to make it into protocols, have to make it into medical schools. And there is research that suggests that it takes 17 years before an accepted research finding becomes part of clinical practice. Michael Greger, the author of How to Not Die, mentions this quite a bit, that's almost 20 years between like showing in a study that something is effective and it actually making it into like a doctor's office. So I kind of think we're caught in the middle of that right now.
I believe that, yeah.
And I also think that nutrition research is notoriously extremely difficult to do our gold standard clinical trials on, which are randomized controlled, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials. It's very hard to control in nutrition studies. And unfortunately, what that's led to is a lot of confusion and a lot of different information within the nutrition research sphere, which has led to, I think, some, dogmatic factions, within the nutrition space and some confusion. So I think there's a number of factors, but those are 2 that I think, there's good intentions out there, but the way our system is set up, which is very rigorous and very sort of guidelines focused, is kind of shooting us in the foot, I think, a little bit here, because it's taking us a long time to adopt some of the research findings that really, I think, in my personal opinion and my interpretation of the literature, show that these refined foods are really killing us. Yeah.
Yeah. You guys want to go down the rabbit hole, check out Gary Taubes' interview that we spent an hour the history and bad science is. He's got a name for it, pathological science. But you can check this out, that question. It's a very interesting question, because the calories in, calories out was definitely debunked a long time ago, or should be anyway. So before we end and tell the folks where to go to Levels and everything, tell the folks, I have a kind of a question I love, and hopefully people are enjoying the answers. But on a micro level and a macro level, like what do you see your company, yourself, the short term, how you want to affect, how you guys want to affect, and how you personally want to affect change in this area through the device, your company, whatever. And then the second part of it is like, how do you see it playing out over 10, 15, the next decade or whatever? And I know they're speculation at best, but you've got a good grasp on what's going on out there. So tell the folks what you're thinking.
Yeah. So in the short term, my main goal is to reignite individuals with a feeling, or maybe ignite for the first time, individuals with the feeling that they have agency over the direction of their health and their lives. I think we live in a very complex world right now where there's a lot of factors sort of against us in our quest to be healthy. We have a very strong media culture. We have our devices that we're latched onto. We've got food that is designed to take us to our neurologic bliss point and tap into our primal reward circuitry pathways. I mean, we have sedentary environments in our schools, homes, and work. It is monumental you have to make so much effort to get out of sort of the trap of being unhealthy. And I think that feeling empowered and feeling control and tapping into what's going on inside our bodies and linking that with how we're actually feeling, our subjective experience, I think all those things together will lead to a really positive mindset shift that I have control, I have knowledge, I have good information, and I can make good choices that lead to good results. Like that, I mean, a lot of people, I think, feel like it's like impossible. It's just so hard. And so empowerment is my number one first priority, empowering individuals to feel agency in their lives. I think when you have that in a realm like food and lifestyle, it can also spill over into many other aspects of your life as well. So I think wearables, and I think biowearables, and I think closed loop biofeedback that give us some control in the face of just a lot of monumental challenges we're facing, I think that's my focus. I think big picture, where I see this going is, first step, we need to see sort of more mainstream interest and adoption in people wearing, wearables and biowearables and things like that. And I think we're starting to see huge movement with that, with like the Fitbits and the Whoops and the trackers. We're seeing people really adopt these. A large percentage of Americans are using them. And we're starting to see incredible like research coming out that wearing these types of things actually does improve health behaviors. It makes the Fitbits make people walk more. They're useful. I think then the second step is for something like a continuous glucose monitoring program, showing with clinical research that these things are actually improving people's health in a meaningful way and improving, long-term adherence to healthy diets and actually improving metabolic health metrics. And then I think we're going to see payers and employers starting to look into this as actually like a really positive way to impact the health of their customers or their employees or whatnot, and realize that when you get, your population of either insured or employees having their glucose stable, their diets healthier, you actually see massive return on investment. So I think we're going to see, adoption, research, and then more mainstream use. But so that's really my hope, is that we start to see the value of this on a more population level. And then I think macro level, I think we're going to see improvements in chronic disease. We're going to see improvements in healthcare economics as well. We spend almost $4 trillion on healthcare costs in this country, and a huge majority of that is on chronic preventable illness. And so I think there's a huge value proposition here, but that will emerge over the coming years. And we're seeing within healthcare a movement towards value-based care systems. So traditionally, we've been more of a fee-for-service model of healthcare, where you get paid as a doctor for sort of doing something, some reactive measure to someone. And we're moving more towards a value-based care system, where we're actually being paid for outcomes. So the value equation is outcomes over cost. You want a high-value intervention where you have good outcomes for a low cost. And I think glucose is at the core of that, because it's easy and cheap to get glucose under control. And so the outcomes is very, very high, and the cost is very, very low. And so I think it's going to fit really nicely into that movement. So that's kind of the bigger picture trajectory I see.
That was awesome. Thank you. This has been like one of the highlights of my 50 interviews. I swear, this is wonderful, really.
Thank
I mean,
you.
I'm so happy to get this information out to folks, to get them to understand it. I'm trying to be a little bit of a futurist at my heart. So I think that folks they just need this kind of information. So you've done just such a great job, and I want to thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, tell the folks where they can find levels and all that kind of stuff, and a little bit about it if you'd like.
Sure, absolutely. So if people are interested in glucose monitoring, you can check us out at www.levelshealth.com. And we actually have a wonderful blog at levelshealth.com/blog, where we have some of the top leaders in healthcare writing about topics around metabolic health and glucose. So I highly recommend that. We're actually in a closed beta program right now we haven't launched fully. And so sign up on our website for our wait list, and we will absolutely be moving through that, in the coming year. And you can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Levels, which is actually very fun to follow on social, because people in our beta program, there's a few thousand people using the product right now, post incredible experiments they're doing and insights that they're learning and how they're improving their glucose. And it's just absolutely fascinating to see how people are changing their lives with this information and this software that helps them improve. So really fun to follow that. And then I'm at Dr. Casey's Kitchen on Instagram and Twitter. So Dr. Casey's Kitchen. And I'm plant-based. So I write a lot about plant-based metabolic health. And so that's, would love to connect with anyone on those platforms.
How did you do that? Like when I'm just trying to close here, it's like, oh man. Okay. Well, we'll have to have
follow-up conversation.
We'll have the plant-based part and the calories and the grains and the beans and how do you get your, oh my God, how do you get your fat? Okay. I'm going to read your blog, and then I'll have you on my first podcast. How's that?
Sounds great.
Or our next summit. How's that? Which will be September, and you will definitely be invited back. So
thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and I know you're busy, and we will talk real soon. I'll be talking to some of the guys at your company too. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. We hope you're enjoying all the speakers. We know that 6 or 7 speakers a day is overwhelming, even during a lockdown. To be able to listen to all the speakers over and over again forever and get hundreds of dollars worth of sugar reduction bonuses, make sure that you click on the speakers package link and guarantee your success.